Gideon Varr didn't knock. He rode through Everett Hale's front gate like he already owned the place, 3 men behind him, horses lathered, boots loud on the porch boards before Everett even got to the door. Gideon pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out between 2 fingers like he was offering something to a dog. "Sign it today," he said. "I won't be this generous tomorrow." Everett looked at the paper. A purchase offer. His eastern pasture, the only ground with reliable water, priced at less than a third of what it was worth. "I'm not selling," Everett said. Gideon smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Then God help you," he said, "because nobody else will." He turned his horse and rode out the same way he came in, like the answer didn't matter, like the outcome was already decided, like Everett Hale was already gone and just hadn't figured it out yet. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where an ordinary person stands up against someone who thinks money makes them untouchable, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The woman appeared at the gate on a Thursday morning in late June, and the first thing Everett noticed was that she wasn't wearing shoes. He was at the water trough, running a hand along the gelding's foreleg, checking the swelling that had been there since Monday. He heard the creak of the gate and looked up, and there she was, standing just inside the property line, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come any farther. She was a big woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back tight and a cloth bag hanging from one hand that looked nearly empty. Her feet were wrapped in burlap strips, tied off at the ankle with what appeared to be fence wire, and even from 30 feet away, Everett could see the dark stains soaking through the cloth on her left heel. He straightened up slowly. "You lost?" he called. "No, sir." Her voice was steady. Not loud, but it carried. "I saw your notice at the feed store in Harlow. Ranch hand, no experience required." Everett wiped his hands on his pants. He walked toward her, not fast, and stopped about 10 feet away. She didn't flinch, didn't look down. Most men who came about the job couldn't hold eye contact more than a few seconds. She held his like she had nothing to apologize for. "Notice said ranch hand," he said, "not ranch woman." Didn't say it wasn't either. He looked at her feet. "You walk from Harlow?" "Yes, sir, that's 7 miles. "I know how far it is." He crossed his arms, in burlap. She shifted her weight slightly, the only sign that she was in any pain at all, and said, "My boots gave out about a mile past the creek. I used what I had." Everett studied her for a moment. Not the way some men looked at a woman, sizing up something they thought they were owed. He looked at her the way he looked at a horse. He wasn't sure about trying to find the thing underneath that told him whether the animal would hold or fold when things got hard. What he saw was a woman who had walked 7 miles on a bleeding foot to ask for a job she hadn't been offered yet. "What's your name?" "Mara Whitlock." "Where are you from, Mara Whitlock?" "Originally, Nebraska. Before that, Kansas." "Before that, it doesn't matter much. What kind of work have you done?" She tilted her head slightly, as if organizing something. "Cattle. Some horse training, mostly greenbroke animals that owners gave up on. Fencing, general repairs. Cooking. I kept books for a grain supplier outside of Laramie for 2 winters. I can grow a kitchen garden if the soil cooperates, and I'm given the chance to try." Everett said nothing for a moment. A blue fly landed on the trough rim, and he watched it without really seeing it. "I had a man quit on me last week," he said. "Before him, another one lasted 11 days. Job before that, 8. You understand what I'm saying? That the work is hard. That the work is hard, and that I've stopped pretending it isn't." She nodded. "I don't need it to be easy. I need it to be honest." He uncrossed his arms. "Come up to the porch. Let me look at those feet before you bleed through what's left of that wrapping." "I didn't come here for charity. I know that," he said, already walking. "I came here for a ranch hand. I can't get any work out of one who can't stand up." She hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she followed him. The porch was cluttered with the evidence of a man who lived alone, a cracked boot sitting on the rail, a coil of rope that had been there long enough to gather dust in the curves, 2 coffee mugs that had been there since at least yesterday. Everett pulled a bucket of water from just inside the door and set it on the porch boards without ceremony. "Sit," he said. Mara sat on the wooden crate near the post. She reached down and began unwrapping the burlap herself, which he'd half expected her to insist on. He went inside and came back with a strip of clean cloth and a tin of salve he'd been using on the gelding's leg, which he figured was clean enough for human use. When she got the burlap off her left foot, he saw the heel. It was bad, not life-threatening bad, but bad enough that he didn't understand how she'd been walking on it without limping more visibly. "That's been bleeding a while," he said. "Since the creek. You walked 5 miles on that. It slowed down after the first 2. He crouched down and looked at it properly. The skin was torn, not deeply, but across a wide enough patch that it would be sore for days. He dipped the cloth in the water and handed it to her. "You can do it yourself," he said. "I wasn't planning to make it strange." She almost smiled at that. Almost. She cleaned it herself, not making a sound when the cloth touched the raw part, while he sat back on the step and watched the gelding at the trough. "What happened to your boots?" he asked, not looking at her. "Wore through. I've been meaning to replace them since February. February to June is a long time to mean to do something. I was saving the money for something else." He didn't ask what. It wasn't his business. When she finished, he handed her the salve, and she applied it with the same efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. No drama, no wincing, just getting it done. "I'll need to make something to put on them," she said. "Bandage wrap if you have it, or I can manage with more cloth strips. And something for the bottom. I noticed you have an old saddle in the barn that looks like it hasn't been used in years. If you'd let me take the stirrup leather, I could make something that would hold for a few weeks." Everett looked at her. "You'd make shoes out of a saddle. It's either that or I work barefoot, and I figure that's harder on your porch boards than it is on me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Saddle's in the back of the barn, left side. Take what you need." She nodded once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen what needs doing." He showed her the ranch, the way he showed everything. No speeches, no warnings. Just walked her through it and let her draw her own conclusions. The north fence line needed 4 new posts and about 60 feet of wire. The barn roof had a patch job from 2 years ago that hadn't held through the last winter and was letting weather in on the far corner. The garden behind the house had been abandoned for so long that the weeds were thicker than the soil, but the layout was good, and the water access was there. The gelding in the middle stall had a soft swelling on his left foreleg that had been there a week and wasn't getting better. Mara walked through all of it without saying much. She looked at things carefully. She asked one question about the gelding. "How long has he been resting it?" And when Everett said 4 days, she frowned slightly and crouched beside the leg and ran her hands along it in a way that suggested she knew what she was looking for. "It's not the tendon," she said after a moment. "Doc in town said it might be." "Did he flex it?" "Poked at it some." "Did he flex it?" she said again. Everett paused. "I don't think so." Then he was guessing. She stood up. "It's a bruised heel. Probably caught a stone wrong on that rocky ground east of the creek. He needs different footing, not rest. If you keep him standing on straw with no movement, he'll stiffen up worse. Let him walk slow on the soft ground near the garden, twice a day, 20 minutes. He'll be weight-bearing normal in 10 days. Everett looked at her. "You a horse doctor?" "No. I've just been around enough of them when nobody who called themselves a doctor was available." She looked at the gelding. "His name?" "Cutter." She held out her hand near the stall door, not reaching in, just offering. Cutter stretched his neck and sniffed her, then went back to his hay. "He's not mean," she said. "He's just careful." "That makes 2 of us," Everett said. He hired her that afternoon. He didn't make a production of it. He told her the wage fare, not generous, because the ranch couldn't manage generous right now, and she accepted it without bargaining. He told her the bunkhouse behind the barn was empty and hers to use, that it had a stove and a cot and a door that latched from the inside, and that he kept his business to himself and expected the same. She said that suited her fine. What he didn't say and didn't know how to say was that in the 10 minutes she'd spent looking at Cutter, she'd told him more about that horse than the veterinarian in Harlow had told him in 2 visits. And that the way she'd looked at the broken fence posts, tallying them quietly, not sighing, not complaining, reminded him of a competence he hadn't seen on this property in a long time. He didn't say any of that. He just showed her where the tools were kept and left her to it. By 4 that afternoon, she had replaced 2 fence posts. By dark, she had started clearing the near corner of the garden. He watched from the kitchen window for a while, not because he was suspicious, but because he genuinely couldn't tell if what he was seeing was real. A woman who had walked 7 miles on bleeding feet was pulling weeds in his garden in fading light, and she was humming something low and tuneless under her breath, and she didn't look like she was suffering. She looked like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Everett turned away from the window and poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and drank it anyway. The first week was a process of adjustment, mostly on his end. He was used to silence. He'd been used to silence for 6 years, since the accident on the Billings Road that had taken Rebecca and the boy, and in that time he'd arranged his life around the fact that no one was going to be there when he turned around. The ranch hands he'd hired since then had all been temporary men who ate in the bunkhouse, worked their hours, and kept clear of him, which he'd preferred. Mara was different without trying to be. She didn't impose herself. She didn't chatter or tell stories or try to draw him out, but she was present in a way that had a kind of weight to it. He'd come out to find her already at the fence line, already halfway through what he'd planned to do himself. He'd walk into the barn, and she'd be there with Cutter, walking him slow on the soft ground just like she'd said, talking to the horse in a quiet voice that stopped whenever it came in and started again when he left. On the 4th morning, he came out at first light and found her on the barn roof, not patching it, stripping off the bad section entirely, pulling up boards with a pry bar, stacking them to the side. She'd been up there long enough that she'd cleared a 6-foot section and was already measuring for the replacement boards. He stood below and looked up at her. "You could have waited," he said. "That's a 2-person job." She looked down at him without pausing. It was a 1-person job until about 30 seconds ago. He climbed up. They worked the roof together for 3 hours without saying much. She knew what she was doing, could read a pitch and set a nail line without being shown, and at some point he stopped thinking of it as supervising and just started working beside her. When they came down for water, she said, "How long has that patch been leaking?" 2 years. It looked like 3. It looked worse from inside, he admitted. She drank her water and looked up at what they'd done. "We can finish it tomorrow, if the lumber gets here. I ordered it Monday. Should be at the freight yard by tomorrow afternoon." She nodded. "Then, do you want me to go get it, or will you?" "I'll go," he said. "You can take Cutter for his walk." She almost smiled again. He was starting to recognize when it was coming a slight shift around the eyes, something that didn't quite reach her mouth, but came close. "He likes the far side of the garden," she said, "near the fence. I think the grass is softer there." "I know," Everett said. "He's always liked that patch." Something passed between them that wasn't a conversation, just a shared understanding of something small that mattered. Then Mara picked up the pry bar and went back to stacking the boards, and Everett went inside to eat, and that was the end of it. The shoes she made from the saddle leather were rough but functional strips cut and folded and stitched with a heavy needle she'd found in the barn repair kit, shaped around her foot and lashed with cord. They didn't look like anything you'd see in a store window, but she wore them every day, and they held. And after the first week, the heel had healed enough that she wasn't favoring it anymore. On the 8th day, she came to him with a question. She found him in the kitchen, going over the ledger, which was not something he let people see normally. But she knocked on the open door frame and waited, and he waved her in because he'd already given up pretending she was temporary. "I was cleaning the bunkhouse," she said, "and I found a bag behind the wall planks. I didn't open it." He looked up. "Behind the planks?" "Loose board, near the stove. I noticed it when I was checking the stovepipe for cracks." She held out a small canvas bag. "I didn't open it." He took it. Inside were 3 gold coins and a folded note he recognized immediately. It was from a hired man named Pelton, who'd worked the ranch for about 6 weeks 2 years back and left without explanation. The note said only, "For the time I broke the wheel on your buckboard. Sorry I didn't tell you." Everett sat with that for a moment. "You could have kept it," he said. "I wouldn't have known." "I know I could have," she said. "That's not the point." He set the bag on the table. 3 gold coins is a lot of money. "It's yours." He looked at her. She didn't have the expression of someone who'd just done something noble and wanted credit for it. She looked like someone who had simply done the obvious thing and didn't understand why it was remarkable. "I'll add it to your wages," he said. "No, Mara." "No," she said again, not unkindly. "It belongs to your ranch." "Not to me." "Don't make it complicated," he didn't argue. He put the bag in the desk drawer and went back to the ledger, and she went back to the bunkhouse, and neither of them mentioned it again. But that night, sitting in the dark kitchen with the lamp turned low, Everett thought about it. About what kind of person found 3 gold coins and brought them to someone else without wavering. About what it said about what she'd been through, that honesty had stayed that clean in her after what was clearly a hard road. He didn't know her story. She hadn't offered it and he hadn't asked. But he knew what the burlap on her feet meant, And he knew what an empty bag meant, and he knew that a woman who could do everything she could do and still ended up walking 7 miles to ask for a ranch hand job had not gotten there easily. He wasn't curious about it in a prying way. He was curious, the way you're curious about a thing that's more than it first appeared, the way you look at a piece of land and realize the topography is more complicated and interesting than the flat map suggested. On the 13th day, she was in the barn loft checking the hay stores when she heard horses on the road. 3 riders came through the gate without stopping, which was the first thing wrong. Everett was at the north fence and Mara was alone in the barn. She came down the loft ladder and stood in the barn doorway, and the 3 men pulled up in the yard and looked at her. The one in front was heavy-set, somewhere around 50, with a face that had the particular smoothness of a man who'd always had enough to eat and enough men to do things for him. His coat was good. His horse was better. He looked at Mara the way some men look at things that are in their way. "Where's Hale?" he said. "Not here," she said. "Where is he?" "He'll be back later." The man looked her up and down, slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that was meant to make her understand what he thought she was worth. "You must be the hired woman," he said. "Heard about you." She didn't say anything. "I'm Gideon Varr," he said. "I expect Hale's mentioned me. He hasn't." That seemed to briefly annoy him, though he smoothed it over fast. "Tell him I came by. Tell him I'm making an offer on the eastern pasture. Fair price, first and last time." "I'll tell him you came by," she said. "Make sure you get the message right now." She looked at him. Just looked, straight and steady, the same way she'd looked at Everett that first morning. Gideon Varr shifted in his saddle, which was a small and probably unconscious thing, but Mara noticed it. She noticed most things. He pulled his horse around, and the 3 men rode back out the gate, and she stood in the barn doorway and watched them go. When Everett came back an hour later, she told him. He went still in a way that she'd learned to recognize later, not frozen, but contained, like something that was run very fast on the inside, and had learned to keep the outside slow and quiet. "He say anything else?" Everett asked. "No, just the offer. Eastern pasture. That land's got the only reliable water on this property." "I figured," she said. "The way the topography runs east, and the creek line." "He knows that too." Everett set down the tools he was carrying. "What did he look like?" "Like a man who's never been told no and doesn't plan to start now." Everett nodded slowly. "That's him." The trouble in town started the following week. Mara had ridden in with Everett to pick up supplies, which was practical. She knew the list and could carry more than he could, and he wasn't too proud to admit it. The feed store owner, a thin man named Cresswell, looked at her the way a cat looks at something it isn't sure about. He was fine until another customer came in, a woman with a neat hat and a mouth like a trap, and then the atmosphere in the store changed in a way Mara had felt before and knew how to read. The woman with the hat looked at Mara, and then looked at Cresswell, and then said, "Loud enough to be a performance? Is this the one?" Cresswell cleared his throat. "Mrs. Aldgate." "I heard she just walked up to his gate," the woman said, as if Mara weren't standing 4 feet away. "Barefoot, in the middle of the day. What kind of woman does that?" Mara picked up the bag of oats she'd already paid for and didn't look at the woman. "A hungry one," she said, and walked out. She could hear Everett behind her, heard the flat tone he used with the store owner, the kind that didn't raise its voice but closed doors, and then he was beside her at the wagon. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. You don't have to pretend." She looked at him. "I'm not pretending. I've been talked about before. It doesn't change what I did today." He was quiet for a moment, loading the supplies. "Then what did you do today?" "Fixed the water trough valve that's been half stuck since I got here, walked Cutter his 20 minutes, cleared the last third of the garden plot, and rode 7 miles to get supplies for a ranch that needs them." She picked up another sack. "What that woman said doesn't undo any of that." Everett loaded his side of the wagon without answering. But she saw something shift in his expression, something he didn't know she was watching, and maybe wouldn't have shown if he had. It was respect. Quiet and clean, the kind that doesn't make a speech. She turned back to the loading before he could notice she'd seen it. 3 days later, she found the threatening letter. It was mixed in with the old papers in the barn office, a small room off the main stall area, with a desk that Everett used for the ranch ledger, and nothing much else. She'd been looking for a bill of sale for the lumber when she came across a folded sheet at the back of the desk drawer, and something about it made her look closer. It wasn't signed, but it referenced the eastern pasture and a date from the previous autumn. and used language that was very careful without being careful enough, the kind of language that implies a threat without quite stating one, because whoever wrote it knew enough to stay one step back from the line. She read it twice and put it back exactly where she'd found it. Then she found Everett. He was at the north fence. She waited until he'd finished driving the post he was working on, because that was the kind of thing that needed to be finished before you interrupted it. "There's a letter in your barn office," she said. "Old paper, back of the desk drawer, behind the bill receipts." He looked at her. "You reading my papers? I was looking for the lumber bill. I found something that wasn't the lumber bill." "What does it say?" "It says someone was very unhappy about you not selling the eastern pasture." It says it in the kind of language that doesn't quite sit directly. She paused. "It's not signed." Everett put down the post driver. "How old? Papers from last October, maybe." Ink's faded some. He started toward the barn. She walked beside him. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "The freight rates for last winter. I was looking at the ledger last week, not going through it, just the pages you left open, and the cost per hundredweight jumped in November. Then again in January, freight company raises rates. Not usually twice in 3 months. And not usually after a rancher refuses to sell." He stopped walking and looked at her. "I don't know if it means anything," she said. "But it's a pattern. And patterns are worth looking at before they become a problem." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You notice a lot." "Noticing things kept me out of trouble more than once," she said. "Seems like a useful habit." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men looked at her in town, not assessing or dismissive or performing indifference. Just looking, the way she'd looked at him that first morning. Then he went into the barn to read the letter, and she went back to the garden, and neither of them said anything else about it that day. But some things had shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way things shift in stories, where people say exactly what they mean and everything lands clean. More like the way ground shifts in spring, invisible, gradual, until one day you step in a place that used to be solid and find that something underneath it has changed. The night of the storm came 3 weeks in. It started as wind the kind that didn't announce itself but arrived all at once, rattling the barn doors and lifting the tarp she'd put over the repaired roof section while the sealant dried. Mara woke in the bunkhouse to the sound of something hitting the ground outside and was on her feet before she was fully awake. She didn't go for Everett first. She went for the barn. The horses were already upset she could hear them before she got to the door. That particular high-pitched sound that meant fear and not just restlessness. She got the bar off the door and went in and started talking before she'd even lit the lantern. Low voice, steady cadence. Not the words mattering, but the sound mattering. Cutter had kicked through the bottom rail of his stall in his panic. The 2 mares in the east stalls were pressed into the back corners. The sky outside had opened up, and the rain was coming in sideways through the gap in the roof tarp, and the hay in the corner was getting wet. She moved the horse's first cutter to the far stall that was dry, the mares together to the center pair. She pulled the tarp back over the roof gap from inside, using the long-handled hook she'd found in the repair kit, which wasn't designed for that but worked well enough. She found the bucket that had blown off the shelf and wedged it under the drip. She got the horses water because frightened horses sometimes drink less, and she wasn't going to have Cutter go backward on his healing because of a storm. She was halfway through forking down fresh hay when Everett appeared in the barn doorway, lamp in hand, rain soaked through his shirt. He stopped and looked at the barn, looked at the horses, settled in their stalls, looked at the tarp, secured, looked at Mara, standing in the middle of the aisle with a pitchfork in both hands and hay in her hair. "I was going to come help," he said. "I know," she said. "It just needed doing." He set the lamp down on the shelf hook and without saying anything else, picked up the second fork and helped her finish the hay. They worked together in the sound of the storm, which was starting to ease now, the worst of it moving east. At some point, the rain dropped from a roar to a steady sound, and then to something lighter, and the horses calmed all the way down, and the barn was dry except for the edge of the bucket's drip, which wasn't worth worrying about. When they were done, Everett set his fork against the wall and looked at her. He looked at her, the way he'd looked at the letter, the way he looked at the fence line when he was trying to determine what it actually needed, carefully, without deciding in advance what he was going to find. "Why did you come here?" he asked, not accusatory, just asking. She leaned the pitchfork against the stall post. "I told you, the notice. There are other ranches." You must have passed 3 on the road from Harlow. She was quiet for a moment. The other notices said experienced hands only, she said. Yours said no experience required. That usually means one of 2 things. Either the work is terrible or the situation is desperate. It was some of both. I know that now. She brushed the hay off her sleeve. But it also meant you weren't going to turn me away on paper before you saw what I could do. That mattered. He was quiet. The last of the rain tapped at the barn roof. You've been turned away before, he said. More times than I can count, she said, without bitterness. On sight, mostly. Before I opened my mouth, he didn't pretend not to understand what she meant. This ranch needed the work, she said. And I needed the work. Those 2 things matched. That's all I was thinking when I walked through your gate. And now? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Now I think it might be more complicated than that. She picked up the lamp and walked to the barn door, and he followed, and they went out into the aftermath of the storm, the smell of wet earth and pine, and something clean, and walked back to their separate buildings without another word. But Everett stood outside his door for a moment before going in, and he looked at the bunkhouse window where her lamp still burned, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something he didn't have a clean name for yet, something that felt, uncomfortably and undeniably, like the beginning of something. The morning after the storm, Everett found 3 fence posts knocked flat along the south line, and a section of wire pulled loose where the ground had softened, and the anchor stakes had given way. It wasn't catastrophic damage. Storms did what storms did, but it meant a full day of work, maybe more, and the eastern pasture gate had swung so hard on its hinge that the wood had cracked along the latch side. He was looking at the gate when Mara came up beside him with 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed to him without asking if he wanted it. He took it. Gate's repairable, she said. I can sister a new board along the cracked section. Stronger than it was before if we do it right. South fence is down in 3 places. I saw. I walked the line at first light. She sipped her coffee. The middle post was already rotting at the base. Storm just finished what was already started. The other 2 are just pulled anchors, half-hour each, maybe less if the ground softened up enough to make setting easier. He looked at her. You walked the whole south line this morning? Couldn't sleep after the rain stopped. Seemed like a useful way to spend the time. He drank his coffee and looked at the broken gate, and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he'd had hands who'd worked this ranch for a month without developing the instinct she'd arrived with in 3 weeks. They split the work without negotiating it much. She took the gate. He took the far post. They met in the middle of the south fence line around noon, both of them dirty and sweat damp, even though the morning had been cool, and they ate lunch sitting on the lowered tailgate of the wagon with a silence that had become, somewhere in the last few weeks, comfortable rather than tense. Varr came by again, Everett said. She looked at him. When? Yesterday morning while you were in the east pasture. I didn't mention it last night because of the storm. What did he say? Same offer, different tone. He broke off a piece of the bread she'd baked 2 days ago, which was still good. He brought a man with him this time, not one of the riders from before. Someone who had the look of a lawyer, or wanted to. Did he have papers? Not yet. Varr said he was having the boundary surveyed. Said he discovered some discrepancy in the original land grant and wanted to make sure everything was settled correctly before we went further. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the fence line, but he could tell she wasn't seeing it. That's not a survey, she said. That's preparation. For what? For a claim. She set down her bread. If a man wants to buy your land and you say no, the next step for a man like that isn't to ask again. It's to find a reason you don't own what you think you own. Everett looked at her steadily. You've seen that before. I've seen something like it. She picked up her bread again, as if she'd decided to finish eating before she decided how much to say. Man named Creel, outside Laramie. He bought up 3 properties in 2 years using surveyor disputes. The surveys were real, official documents, signed and filed. They just weren't accurate. How do you prove a survey's inaccurate? You find the original markers, the ones from the first land grant. And you find someone who knows the difference between a landmark that's always been there and one that got moved. The afternoon came in warm after the cool morning, and they went back to work, and neither of them said anything more about Gideon Varr that day. But Mara thought about it while she repaired the gate, driving the sister board flush against the cracked wood with measured hammer strikes, her mind running the problem from the sides, the way she ran most problems, not straight at it, but around it, looking for the shape. The gossip in Harlow reached a new level the second time she went into town alone. Everett had sent her for a specific hinge bolt that the hardware store had to order in, and she'd gone on a Tuesday when the town was quieter. She got the bolt, picked up the mail from the post office, and was heading back to the wagon when she heard her name not spoken to her, but about her, from the gap between the millinery and the land office, where two women were talking with their backs to the street. She didn't stop. She wasn't going to stand in an alley and eavesdrop on people talking about her body and her situation, and what they imagined Everett Hale wanted with a woman who looked the way she looked. She'd heard versions of that conversation before, in Nebraska and Kansas, and a dozen places in between, and she knew how it went, and she knew it said nothing true about her, and everything true about the people saying it. What she hadn't expected was the man at the wagon. He was leaning against the wheel when she came around the corner, young, maybe 25, with a jacket that was too good for a town like Harlow, and the confident posture of someone who'd been told all his life that his presence was welcome wherever he put it. "Miss Whitlock?" he said. She stopped 3 feet from him. "Yes. My name's Denton. I work for Mr. Varr." He said it. The way some men say a name like the saying of it was supposed to do something, shift the air, make her step back. "He'd like me to pass along his regards." "His regards are noted," she said. "Now move away from my wagon." He didn't move. "He's also asked me to let you know that the situation with the Hale property is likely to become complicated very soon. He thought you should be aware, given your employment there." She looked at him. "He wanted you to know," Denton continued, "that when things change, and they will change a woman in your position, would do well to have other options already in place. Mr. Varr is a generous man to people who make wise decisions." She put her hand on the wagon rail and looked at him directly. "What you just said to me is the cleanest kind of threat. You dressed it up nice, but it's still what it is. I wouldn't call it, I would." She climbed up to the seat without rushing. "Tell Varr I got his message. Tell him I said no. You're making a mistake." "Maybe." She picked up the reins. "But it'll be mine to make." She drove out of Harlow without looking back, and her hands were steady on the reins. And she didn't let herself feel shaken till she was 2 miles clear of town, and there was nothing around her but open country and the sound of the horses' hooves on the road. Then she let herself feel it, the cold edge of it, the knowledge that Varr had sent someone specifically for her, not for Everett, for her. That meant he saw her as something, a variable, a factor in a calculation he was trying to control. She'd been underestimated by powerful men before, and it had sometimes worked in her favor, but this was something different. This was a man who didn't underestimate her, who'd seen her clearly enough to decide she was worth threatening. She drove the rest of the way back thinking about what that meant, and what it meant for Everett, and what she was going to do about it. She told Everett that night. All of it, the man at the wagon, the threat dressed as concern, the way Varr had specifically chosen to send a message to her rather than through her. Everett listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was his way. He sat across the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and his face doing the contained thing it did when he was running something through in his mind. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He sent someone for you specifically," he said. "Yes, not for me." "No," he nodded slowly. "He's trying to split us." The word landed between them, us, and neither of them remarked on it, but she felt it settle there, solid. "He thinks if he makes you feel unstable here, you'll leave," Everett said. "And if you leave, I lose whatever support I have, and I'm easier to push." "That's what I thought, too." He looked at her. "Are you going to leave?" She held his gaze. "Are you going to ask me to?" "No." "Then we're in agreement," she said. He got up and poured himself water from the pitcher, which was what he did when he was thinking hard but didn't want to show it. He stood at the counter for a moment. "I'm going to ride the east boundary tomorrow," he said. "Check the original markers. If Varr's planning to file a survey dispute, I want to know exactly where my line is before he does. I'll come with you." He started to say something. She could see the slight hesitation, and then he didn't say it, and nodded instead. "First light," he said. "First light," she agreed. The eastern boundary of the Hale Ranch was marked by a line of stones placed when the land grant was filed in 1871, not fancy, not official looking, but placed by a territorial surveyor who'd used a specific rocky outcrop on the ridge as his reference point. Everett knew where that outcrop was. His father had showed it to him when he was 12 years old, the summer before the ranch had passed into his hands. They rode the line from south to north, and Mara dismounted at each marker stone and looked at it carefully, and Everett watched her do it without fully understanding what she was looking for. At the fourth marker, she stopped for a long time. "This one's been moved," she said. He got down. "How can you tell?" "The ground around the base. See this line here, this shadow in the soil where the moisture's different?" She crouched and pointed. "That stone sat in a different spot until recently. A few months ago, maybe less. The original depression is right there, about 8 inches north." He crouched beside her. He could see it. Now that she'd pointed to it, the faint outline in the earth where the stone had rested for years and years before it hadn't. 8 inches, he said. 8 inches at this point, multiplied across the whole boundary line, adds up to a significant displacement at the water source. He looked up at the ridge, where the rocky outcrop sat in morning light. "If Varr's surveyor uses a different reference point," she said, standing, "and this stone has been moved, then his survey will show a boundary that lines up with the moved marker. And it'll look official and correct, because the stone is where it is. But the original marker is in the ground, 8 inches north, where you can still see the depression if you know to look." She looked at him. Someone moved that stone, Everett, not the storm. The soil disturbance is older than last night." He stood up and looked at the marker, then at the ridge, then at her. "Varr's men," he said, "or someone working for him. Someone who came out here quietly and moved one stone 8 inches and walked away and waited." The pasture stretched out behind them, green and wide, with the creek line visible in the distance. The water source that made this land worth fighting over glittered in the low morning sun. "He's been planning this for a while," Everett said. "Yes, before he ever came to me with an offer. The offer was probably never real," she said. "It was step 1. When you said no, he moved to step 2. Everett looked at the stone for a long moment. Something had gone tight in his jaw, and she gave him the space to be angry without rushing him out of it. "I need to document this," she said quietly, "before anything else happens to it. You got any paper and a decent hand for drawing?" "I can draw a line," he said. "Good enough. And we need a witness. Someone who knows this land and has no connection to Varr." He thought for a moment. "Old Fen Calloway. He's grazed cattle on the ridge above here for 30 years. He knows every rock on this boundary. Can you trust him? Fen Calloway doesn't like Gideon Varr and isn't polite about it. Then he's the right man." They rode back to the ranch, and Everett went for Calloway, and Mara stayed behind and started making a record of everything she'd seen: the stone, the depression, the measurements she'd taken by eye and by the length of her hand. She wrote it out in the clearest language she could manage, setting down every detail in the order she'd noticed it, not guessing where she wasn't certain, noting the date and the light and the conditions. It wasn't a legal document, she knew that, but it was a starting point. And starting points, in her experience, were everything. Fen Calloway was 71 years old and walked with a cane he'd made himself from a branch he particularly liked, and he came to the boundary line that afternoon with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd outlived most of the people who'd ever tried to tell him he was wrong about anything. He looked at the stone. He looked at the depression. He looked at Mara, who'd explained it to him while Everett held the horses. "Moved," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "I grazed cattle on this ridge when Everett's father worked this land," he said. "That stone was at 8 inches north of where it is now. I know because I used to use it as a reference point when I was counting head moving between pastures." He looked at Everett. "I can swear to that before a judge." "It might come to that," Everett said. "Then it comes to that." Calloway thumped his cane against the ground once, as if settling the matter. "I never liked Varr. Man came to me with a purchase offer, and when I said no, my fence line got cut 3 times in the following month. Nothing he could be tied to. But I know what I know." Mara was writing it all down. Calloway watched her. "You're thorough," he said. "I try to be. Varr sent someone to threaten you," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. "How did you know?" "Because you're the most significant person standing between him and what he wants," the old man said simply. "Everett's stubborn, but he's one man. You're a different kind of problem. You think sideways." He tapped his temple. "Men like Varr don't know what to do with that, so they try to frighten it away." She held his gaze. "It didn't work." "No," he said, and something like satisfaction moved through his voice. "I can see that." The freight rates were the next piece. Mara had been building the picture in her head since she'd noticed the ledger entries, and over the following week, she started asking careful questions, not in Harlow, where everything she did was watched and reported, but in the smaller settlements to the east, where the ranchers who'd sold to Varr had gone when they couldn't hold their land anymore. She rode out on 3 consecutive afternoons, telling Everett where she was going and why, and he didn't try to stop her or come with her, which she appreciated. He understood, she thought, that some conversations happened better without a landowner present. She found a woman named Dottie Crane, 60 years old, who'd sold her property to a Varr associate 18 months ago and now lived in a 2-room house in a settlement called Red Bend that was barely on any map. Dottie had a sharp face and suspicious eyes and made coffee that was mostly hot water, but she talked. She talked about how the freight rates for her cattle shipments had doubled in the spring before the sale. She talked about how her buyer at the stockyard had suddenly started finding reasons to reject her animals on quality grounds, animals she'd been selling to the same yard for 10 years. She talked about how a water dispute had appeared from nowhere, a neighbor claiming rights to a shared creek that they'd shared without complaint for 15 years. All at once, Dottie said. That's what I remember most. It wasn't one thing, it was everything, all at the same time. Like the ground just opened up. Did you know at the time that it might be connected? Mara asked. I thought I was just unlucky. Dottie looked out her window at a view that was considerably smaller than what she'd once had. I was stupid. You weren't stupid. You were alone and overwhelmed, and you didn't have someone pointing at the connections. The old woman looked at her. And now? Now I'm pointing at them, Mara said. If you'd be willing to tell this to someone official, a judge, maybe would you do it? Dottie was quiet for a long moment. What would it change, she said. I already sold. Land's gone, it might not change yours, Mara said honestly. But there are others still in the middle of it. And if the pattern gets documented officially, on record, then it becomes harder for Varr to keep doing it. Dottie looked at her coffee cup. Who are you exactly? You're not a lawyer. No. You're not official anything. No, you're just a ranch hand. Yes, ma'am. Dottie turned her cup in her hands. A ranch hand who rides out to Red Bend on a Tuesday afternoon to ask about freight rates. I notice things, Mara said. I write them down. And I'm stubborn enough that it bothers me when powerful men do things they know are wrong, because they're betting nobody will put in the work to prove it. Dottie looked at her for a long time. Come back Thursday, she said. I'll have my records ready. By the time she'd ridden to 3 more properties and collected 4 sets of records freight invoices, stockyard rejection notices, letters from lawyers she hadn't hired, one remarkably direct note that stopped just short of a threat, Mara had built something she hadn't expected to build so fast. She laid it out on the table in the barn office on a Sunday evening because the kitchen table was too small, and she stood back and looked at it the way she looked at fence lines trying to find the gap, the weakness, the place where the whole thing could be refuted. Everett came in and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. This is a pattern, he said finally. It's more than a pattern. It's a method. Every sale he's made in the last 4 years was preceded by at least 2 of these freight disruption, stockyard interference, water dispute, legal threat, sometimes all 4, always within 6 months of a rejected offer. He leaned forward and looked at the freight invoices. These are real documents. Originals or direct copies. The women I spoke to kept everything. She paused. Poor people keep everything, generally. They can't afford not to. And Dottie Crane will talk to a judge? She will. So will a woman named Harkett and a man named Shoeless, who sold his south pasture 3 years ago. She looked at the spread of paper. But I need the survey dispute documented first, before Varr files his claim. If we wait until he files, we're reacting. I want to be ahead of it. The Territorial Land Office is in Caldwell. I know. That's 40 miles. I know that too. He straightened up and looked at her directly. You've been working on this for 2 weeks. On top of everything else. Yes. You could have told me earlier. I didn't want to tell you until I knew it was real. She looked at the documents. I've been wrongs before. I don't like bringing people problems I'm not sure of. He was quiet for a moment. You should have told me. She looked at him. Are you upset? No. He said it simply, and she believed him. This is your work, Mara. This is your doing. I should have known what you were doing, so I could have helped. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, skepticism, maybe, or the particular male frustration of a man who felt like he should have been the one doing something. Not this. I'll tell you sooner, she said. Next time. Good. He looked at the documents again. When do we ride to Caldwell? Monday, if you can be ready. I'll be ready Sunday night, he said, and went back to the house. and she stood alone in the barn office, with the evidence spread across the table, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not happy, exactly. Not safe, exactly. But close, something in the neighborhood of both. The storm had moved on, but the week had left. Something shifted, not just in the evidence she'd gathered or the plans they were making, but in the daily rhythm of the ranch itself. There was a new ease in how they worked together, less of the careful stepping around each other that had marked the first weeks. She'd started leaving coffee ready in the morning because she was up first and it made sense, and he'd started not remarking on it, which meant he'd accepted it, which was its own kind of conversation. She fixed the things she found broken without asking permission first. He stopped explaining what needed doing and started telling her what he was thinking, which was different and better. On Thursday, Cutter took weight on his repaired leg with no hesitation, walked a full 30 minutes on the soft ground without favoring it, and then stood still while Mara ran her hands along the tendon and found nothing to worry about. She went to find Everett. "He's sound," she said. Everett looked at her. Then he went to the paddock and stood beside the gelding for a long moment, running his hand along the same place she'd checked. 3 weeks, he said. 10 days more like it, she said. He got there. Everett looked at the horse the way you look at something you were afraid of losing and didn't. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She went back to the garden, where the beans had come up in a line that would have been straight if she'd been more careful with the furrow, but was close enough to straight that it would do. The day before they were to ride to Caldwell, Gideon Varr came back to the ranch. This time he didn't come with 3 men. He came with 6, and a man in a good coat who was definitely a lawyer. And he came at midday when the sun was high, and there was nowhere to be that wasn't visible. Mara was repairing the chicken coop latch when she heard the horses. She stood up and watched them come through the gate, and then she walked to the house and knocked on the doorframe. "Varr," she said. Everett came out. Varr pulled up in the yard and looked at both of them standing on the porch together, and something moved through his expression that wasn't quite displeasure. More like calculation. "Hale," he said. "I've had my surveyor complete his work on the eastern boundary." "Have you?" Everett said. "There's a discrepancy of approximately 12 feet from the current fence line. My surveyor's report places the boundary well inside what you've been calling your eastern pasture." Varr gestured to the man in the good coat, who produced a folded document. "This is a formal notice of boundary dispute. You'll have 30 days to respond to the Territorial Land Office in Caldwell." Mara stepped off the porch, just one step. "What landmark did your surveyor use as his reference point?" she said. Varr looked at her. The lawyer looked at her. "I'm sorry?" Varr said. "Your survey." "What landmark was used as the reference point for the boundary calculation?" Varr looked at his lawyer. The lawyer said, "The boundary stone at the 4th marker position along the eastern line was—" "That stone was moved," Mara said. "We have a witness who grazed cattle on the ridge above that line for 30 years and can testify to its original position. We also have a photograph of the soil's disturbance showing the original location and documentation of when the movement occurred." She looked at Varr. "Your survey is built on a marker that wasn't in its original position, which means your survey, whatever it says, is measuring from the wrong place." The yard was very quiet. Varr's horse shifted. One of the men behind him coughed. "That's a very serious accusation," Varr said. His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, running fast. "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was meant to land like a hand on a throat. She'd seen it before from men who thought the looking was enough. She looked back. "We'll see each other in Caldwell," she said. 30 days is more than enough time." Varr held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and the 6 men followed him out, and the lawyer went last, looking back at her over his shoulder as if trying to decide what exactly she was. Everett came down off the porch and stood beside her. "You probably just made him angry," he said. "He was already angry," she said. "He was just hiding it better before." "True." He looked at the gate where they'd gone. "You're not afraid of him." She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of what he can do," she said. "That's different from being afraid of him." Everett nodded slowly. "We leave tomorrow. Early. I'll have the wagon ready at first light," she said, and went back to the chicken coop latch, because it still did fixing and the day wasn't done. They left before dawn. Mara had the wagon ready at 4:30, which was earlier than first light by a good margin, because 40 miles of territory road in summer meant starting before the heat settled in and the horses started working against the temperature instead of with it. She'd packed the documents in a leather satchel she'd borrowed from the barn office, Everett's satchel, old and cracked at one corner but solid, and wrapped the whole thing in oilcloth in case the weather turned. Everett came out of the house at 4:45 with 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth and said nothing about how early it was. He climbed up, she handed him the reins because it was his wagon and his horses, and they rolled out through the gate, while the sky was still the dark blue that comes just before the black starts to lift. They didn't talk much the first hour. The road was familiar to Everett and new enough to Mara that she spent it watching the land, the way the terrain changed as they moved east and south, the grass getting shorter and the rock breaking through the surface more often, the sky opening up in the way it only does when you're moving through open country at a speed that lets you feel it. At some point she said, "Tell me about Varr." Everett kept his eyes on the road. "What do you want to know? How he started, how he got to where he is." His father had cattle money. Not a fortune, but enough to get started. Gideon took what his father left and built it into something bigger through land acquisition. Bought low, sold high when the freight lines moved in, bought again. Smart enough, ruthless enough. He adjusted his grip on the reins. There used to be people in this county who said he was just a hard businessman. Played rough, but stayed legal. And now there are fewer people saying that, but they say it quieter. She looked at the road ahead. He's been doing this long enough that people have accepted it as just how things are. That's about right. That's the most dangerous kind of wrong, she said, when it's been going on long enough that nobody remembers it being different. Everett glanced at her. "You sound like you've thought about that before." "I've lived in enough places where someone had that kind of power," she said. "Kansas. Parts of Nebraska. It's always the same shape, just different names on the door." He didn't ask her to say more, and she didn't offer it. And the wagon rolled on through the thinning dark. And by the time the sun came up properly, they were past the halfway point, and Mara had eaten both biscuits because Everett said he wasn't hungry, which she suspected wasn't entirely true, but she didn't argue about it. The Territorial Land Office in Caldwell was a 2-story stone building on the main street that had the particular look of a place that handled important things without wanting to appear important about it. The sign above the door was painted in plain black letters. The steps were worn in the middle from years of boots going up and down. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from his desk when they came in. "Help you." Everett said his name and the nature of the business, the boundary dispute, the formal notice he'd received, the counterfiling he needed to make, and the clerk's expression shifted slightly in the way that meant he recognized the name of the property, or the name of the opponent, or possibly both. "You'll want to speak to the senior records officer," the clerk said. "He handles contested filings." "We'll wait," Mara said. The senior records officer was a man named Aldous Beach, somewhere in his late 50s, with the careful eyes of a man who read documents for a living and had learned to notice the things that didn't line up. He brought them into a back office that smelled of paper and dust and something that might have been old coffee, and he sat down and looked at what they put in front of him. He read the boundary notice from Varr's lawyer first. Then he looked at Mara's documentation, the position of the stone, the soil disturbance, the measurements. Fen Calloway's witness statement that she'd written out in full and had Calloway sign and date. He read it carefully. He went back to the boundary notice. He looked at her documentation again. "You measured the displacement yourself?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Against the depth of the original depression, I estimated 8 inches. Calloway confirmed the original position independently. "Calloway's been on that ridge for 30 years? He says so. He used the stone as a reference point for cattle counting. He remembers exactly where it was." Beach set the papers down. "And the survey that Varr's team produced, you're claiming, it uses the displaced stone as its reference?" "I'm saying it appears to." The survey report isn't specific about which marker was used as the primary reference, which is itself unusual. A properly executed survey names its reference points clearly. Beach looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "You have legal experience, Miss Whitlock?" "No, sir. I kept books for a grain supplier in Laramie for 2 winters. I read a lot of contracts and invoices. I know what careful documentation looks like, and I know when something's missing that should be there." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. "I can file your counterclaim today," he said. "The dispute will be officially contested. which means Varr can't take action on the boundary until the matter is resolved. But you'll need a formal independent survey, one that names its reference point specifically and can be verified against the original 1,871 land grant. How long does that take? Everett asked. Survey itself, a week or two. Getting it scheduled and the surveyor out there 2 more weeks, minimum, if I put a priority flag on it. He looked at Everett. Which I can do. Why would you do that? Mara asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. Beach looked at her for a moment. Then he said, because this is the 4th filing related to Gideon Varr's land acquisitions that I've seen in 3 years, and it's the first one that came in with this level of documentation on the opposing side. He straightened the papers. I'll file it today. They were back on the road by early afternoon, the counterclaim filed and receipted, with a case number and Aldous Beach's name on the record. The sun was high and the horses worked steadily, and Mara sat with the oilcloth satchel on her lap and felt the specific exhaustion of a day that had required constant alertness. He said 4th filing, she said, after they'd been on the road a while. I heard, Everett said. 3 others before us, and not one of them made it to a counterclaim. Because they didn't know they could, or they knew and they were too beaten down to try. She looked at the road. Beach knows there's something wrong with how Varr operates. He's been watching it from the office side, but he can't act without someone bringing him cause. Right. She turned the satchel in her hands. We gave him cause. Everett was quiet for a moment. You gave him cause. That documentation didn't write itself. She didn't answer that directly, because compliments still sat awkwardly on her, and she hadn't found a natural way to receive them. I want to go back to Red Bend, she said instead, and the other properties. I want to ask about Beach's 3 other cases, find out which ranchers filed and when and what happened. Because if the pattern holds, you think they were pressured into dropping their claims. I think it's possible. And if that's true, then some of those people might be willing to talk again now that someone else is standing up. She paused. Strength in numbers isn't just a phrase, it's a legal reality. A judge looks at a pattern differently than he looks at a single dispute. Everett let the horses find their pace on the downhill stretch before he answered. Mara, he said, what you did in that office today. I just organized the information. Don't do that, he said. She looked at him. Don't reduce it down to nothing, he said. Beach sat up straighter when you talked. That doesn't happen because someone organized information. She looked back at the road. I don't know how to respond to that. You don't have to, he said. I'm just saying it so it's said. They drove the rest of the way home in the long summer evening, the light going golden, and then amber, and Mara thought about 3 other filings that had never made it anywhere, and about the people behind them, and about what it would take to reach those people before Varr found a way to make the ground open up under this case too. The rumors started within a week of their return. She'd expected something. Varr wasn't the kind of man to file a formal response and wait quietly, but the specific shape of it still caught her off guard. Not because she hadn't thought about her past, but because she'd thought the past was far enough away not to follow her to Montana. She heard it first from Fen Calloway, who rode down from the ridge on a Wednesday morning, looking like a man who'd eaten something that disagreed with him. There's talk in Harlow, he said, before he'd even gotten off his horse. About what? Everett said. Calloway looked at Mara. About her. Stories going around that she left her last position under bad circumstances. Theft, some are saying. Taking money that wasn't hers. The yard went very quiet. Mara stood still. She could feel Everett looking at her, and she didn't look back at him yet because she needed a moment to decide how to carry this. That's not true, she said. I know that, Calloway said. Tell me exactly what they're saying. Specifically, he told her. It was the grain supplier in Laramie, the winter she'd kept books for that operation. The story Varr's people had put into circulation claimed she'd altered ledger entries and taken money from petty cash over the course of several months and left before she could be confronted. It was the kind of lie that was specifically designed to be hard to disprove. No one was naming a witness. No one was citing a record. It was just a story, circulating in the way stories circulate in small communities from mouth to ear, softening at the edges, picking up embellishments. What actually happened at that job? Everett asked. His voice was level. She looked at him now. I kept their books accurately for 2 winters. When the owner's son came back from the east and took over the operation, he didn't want a woman in the position. He dismissed me. He told people I'd left voluntarily because the work was too demanding. She paused. He did not accuse me of theft. There was no accusation. Because there was nothing to accuse. Everett held her gaze. That's what I figured, he said, and turned back to Calloway. Who's spreading it? Can't pin it to a source. It's just everywhere the way those things get. Calloway looked uncomfortable. Some of it's being told by people who don't even know. They're repeating something deliberately planted. Varr, Everett said, has to be. It's too specific and too timed. Your counterclaim was filed, and 3 days later this story appears. Calloway shook his head. He knows what he's doing. He's trying to make Mara look like someone who can't be trusted with records, so that anything she's documented looks like it might have been manipulated. Mara had been running the same calculation in her head since the first sentence Calloway had spoken, and now she said, he's not wrong that it could work. A judge, looking at my documentation, if he's also heard that I have a history of altering records. But there's no proof of any of that, Everett said. There doesn't need to be proof. There needs to be doubt. She looked at the ground for a moment. This is well-timed and well thought out. He's smarter than I gave him credit for. Or he's done it before to someone else, Calloway said. She looked up. Yes. She said it slowly because something had just slid into place. He's done it before. This is the same method, the systematic undermining. Different tools. With the ranchers, he used freight rates and water disputes. With me, he's using reputation. She looked at Everett, which means somewhere there's another person he did this to. Someone he discredited specifically to neutralize them as a witness or an opponent. You want to find them, Everett said. I want to find them before the hearing. The name she found, after 3 days of careful asking in the right directions, was a man called Martin Sayer. Sayer had been a freight inspector for the Territorial Commerce Office until about 2 years ago, when a story had submerged same shape, same sourceless circulation claiming he'd accepted bribes to overlook weight violations. He'd lost his position. The investigation had found no evidence, but by then it hadn't mattered, because the story had done its work. Martin Sayer now lived in a small house outside a town called Fenwick, 22 miles from Harlow, and he grew vegetables and kept chickens and by all accounts had largely given up on any notion of justice. Mara rode to Fenwick alone on a Friday. He met her at the door with the particular wariness of a man who'd learned that strangers asking questions usually made things worse. He was in his late 40s, lean and weathered, with eyes that had the flat quality of a man who'd decided not to hope too hard about anything. I don't know what you think I can tell you, he said, after she'd explained why she was there. I think you can tell me what Varr's freight rates looked like 2 years ago, she said, when you were still in a position to audit them. He was quiet for a long moment. Come inside, he said. He had records. She hadn't expected that most people who'd been burned got rid of the evidence because keeping it felt like keeping the wound open. But Sayer had kept everything in a box under his bed, with the precise and slightly stubborn organization of a man who'd needed to believe the records would matter someday. She sat at his small table and went through them while he made coffee that was actually coffee, and what she saw in those records made her set down her pen and look at the wall for a moment before she picked it up again. The freight rate adjustments Sayer had documented corresponded, within 2 to 3 weeks, to every forced sale in the region over the past 4 years. Everyone. It wasn't approximate. It was surgical rates jumped specifically for the ranchers Varr was targeting, while surrounding shippers saw normal or even slightly reduced rates. Anyone looking at the overall numbers would have seen average costs holding steady. Only someone looking at the individual accounts would see the pattern. You found this when you were inspector, she said. I was starting to. He sat across from her with his coffee. I hadn't completed the analysis yet. But I had enough to ask questions, and I made the mistake of asking them out loud to the wrong person. Who? Harold Pike. He's the territorial commerce official who oversees freight regulation in this region. She looked up. Pike. Yes. I went to him because he was my superior and I thought he should know what I was seeing. Within 2 weeks, the bribery story appeared. Within a month, I was out. His voice was flat, recounting facts. Pike is Varr's man. I understand that now. I should have understood it then. She wrote the name down. Then she wrote it again, larger, because it needed to stay visible. Would you testify to what you found? She asked. The rate records, the pattern, the conversation with Pike? He looked at his coffee cup. Last time I tried to say something official. I lost everything I'd spent 20 years building, he said. My position, my reputation. I spent 8 months defending myself against a lie that nobody was brave enough to trace back to its source. She waited. I'm not saying no, he said. I'm saying I need to know it's different this time. I need to know there's someone actually standing up on the other end, not just gathering information and going home. There is, she said. There's a contested filing at the Territorial Land Office. There's an independent survey being scheduled. There are 4 other witnesses who've agreed to speak to the pattern. She looked at him. I'm not collecting this and going home, Mr. Sayer. I'm building something that can go before a judge. He looked at her for a long time. Who are you? He said. Really? A ranch hand, she said, who got tired of watching a man operate like there were no consequences. He looked at his records box. Then he looked back at her. I'll testify, he said. If it gets to that point, I'll be there. She got back to the ranch after dark, later than she'd planned because one of the back wheels had developed a wobble on the return road, and she'd stopped twice to check the linchpin before she was confident enough to push to full speed again. Everett was on the porch when she came through the gate, which meant he'd been watching the road. Though when she climbed down, he said only, wheels wobbling on the right rear, as if he'd noticed it from the porch by the sound. I know, she said. I'll look at it tomorrow. Sit down first. She sat on the porch step. He went inside and came back with bread and cold beans and set them on the step beside her without ceremony, and she ate while the night made its sounds around them. Sayer will testify, she said, when she'd eaten enough to talk properly. She told him everything, the records, the rate pattern, the name at the center of it. When she said Pike's name, Everett went still. Harold Pike, he said. You know him? I know of him. He was at the cattlemen's meeting in Billings last spring. Varr introduced him. I didn't think much of it at the time. Pike is how Varr keeps the freight rates moving where he wants them. Without Pike, half the economic pressure Varr uses against his target stops working. She looked at the darkness past the gate. He's not just a corrupt official. He's the mechanism. If we can prove Pike's involvement, then we're not just proving a boundary dispute. We're proving a system. She set down the empty bowl. That's a different conversation in front of a judge. Everett was quiet for a while. You rode 22 miles alone today, he said. 22 each way. I should have come with you. You were repairing the North Water Line, which also needed doing. She looked at him. I can ride 44 miles, Everett. I know you can, he said it quietly. That's not what I meant. She looked at him properly then, and he was looking at her with an expression that wasn't about the riding. I know what you meant, she said after a moment. Neither of them said anything else about it, but it sat there between them, acknowledged if not named, the way certain things do when the people involved are both better at working than talking. The independent surveyor arrived 11 days later. His name was Purvis, a compact man with a transit and a set of notes from the 1,871 land grant that he'd obtained directly from the Territorial Archive. He walked the eastern boundary with Everett and Mara both, and he was methodical in the particular way of a man who understood that his work would be contested and wanted no gaps. At the 4th marker stone, he stopped. He set up his transit. He looked at his notes. He looked at the rocky outcrop on the ridge, the same outcrop that had been the reference point for the original survey, and he ran his measurements twice. Then he crouched and looked at the ground around the stone base. This stone has been disturbed, he said. We documented that before you arrived, Mara said. She handed him the record she'd made the measurements, the photograph of the soil disturbance, Calloway's statement. Purvis read it carefully. Your measurements are consistent with what I'm seeing, he said. The stone is currently positioned, placed at the boundary, approximately 9 inches south of where it should be according to the original grant. 9, she said. I estimated 8. Measurement, not estimation, he said, not unkindly. He looked at the boundary and then at the water source visible in the distance. 9 inches here translates to a boundary discrepancy of roughly 14 feet at the creek line, which is enough to move the water source outside the original grant. Yes. He stood up. My report will state that the boundary as currently marked by the 4th stone is inconsistent with the original 1,871 survey reference point, and that the discrepancy appears to result from displacement of the marker. He paused. I'll also note that the displacement appears non-accidental, based on the soil disturbance pattern. Mara looked at Everett. Everett looked at the water source, glinting in the heat. How long for your report? He asked. I'll have it filed with the land office within the week, Purvis said. What happened in Harlow the day after the surveyor's visit was the thing Mara had been half expecting and had not been able to prevent. She'd gone to the feed store for a routine supply run salt blocks and a specific mineral supplement she'd ordered for Cutter, and found a different quality of silence when she walked in. Not the usual watchful quiet of people observing a woman they decided they had opinions about. Something heavier. Cresswell, the store owner, couldn't quite meet her eyes. She paid for the salt blocks and asked about the supplement order and was told it hadn't come in yet, which she suspected was true, based on his discomfort rather than on any deliberate withholding. She picked up what she could carry and was heading for the door when a man she didn't know stepped in from the side, not blocking her, but close enough to be deliberate. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Yes. I'm an associate of Mr. Varr's. My name is Denton." He recognized the name, the man from the wagon in town, the first one who'd come to threaten her. This time he looked more serious. "He'd like me to relay some information." "He can file it with the land office," she said. "It's not about the filing." Denton kept his voice low. "He knows you've been talking to Martin Sayer." She stopped. "Mr. Varr wants you to understand that whatever Sayer told you is the perspective of a disgraced former official who was dismissed for cause. His records are inadmissible on the basis of how they were obtained, and his testimony carries no credibility before a judge." She looked at Denton steadily. "Is that legal advice? Because you're not a lawyer." "It's information." "It's a threat," she said again. "You're good at those." He leaned slightly forward. "You've been working very hard, Miss Whitlock, gathering records, riding around the county, building your little case." He said, little the way men say it when they want to make something smaller than it is. "I want you to think carefully about what happens to someone in your position, your background, your situation if this goes sideways. You have no family here, no standing, you're a hired hand. If Everett Hale loses this ranch, you have nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. "Sayer's records are admissible," she said. "They were obtained during his official tenure as freight inspector. Dismissal doesn't retroactively invalidate documentation made in the course of legal duties. You might want to tell your actual lawyer that." She picked up the salt blocks. "And if you come near me again with another message from Varr, I'll walk directly to the county sheriff and report what you've been doing." Each time. Starting with the first visit, she walked out. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the wagon, which she hadn't expected. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular adrenaline of holding a line when someone is pressing hard against it. She sat for a moment before picking up the reins. Sayer's records were admissible. She was fairly sure that was true. Fairly sure wasn't the same as certain, and she knew it, and she also knew that she'd said it like she was certain, because showing uncertainty to Varr's messenger was exactly what she couldn't afford to do. She drove back to the ranch. That evening, she sat in the barn office and looked at everything she'd assembled. The freight records from Sayer, the witness statements from Dottie Crane, from the woman named Harkett, from the man Solus, the documentation of the moved boundary stone, Purvis's preliminary notes, which he'd given her a copy of before he'd left, the threatening letter from Varr's associate, written in the particular language that meant everything and proved nothing. She'd been building this piece by piece for weeks, fitting it together the way she'd fit boards on the barn roof, checking the pitch, testing the line, looking for the gap where weather could get in. The gap was Pike. She had Sayer's testimony about Pike. She had the rate records that showed the pattern. What she didn't have was anything that directly tied Pike's decisions to Varr's money, a payment, a letter, a transaction that couldn't be explained as coincidence. Without that, Pike was just a man who'd made regulatory decisions that happened to benefit Varr. That was suspicious. It wasn't proof. She was still sitting there at 9 o'clock at night when Everett came in. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "You've been here for 3 hours," he said. "I know." He sat down in the other chair, the one he'd never sat in before when she was using the office, because he'd always knocked and waited at the door. He just sat down, which meant something had shifted again, though she couldn't have said exactly when. "Tell me where the problem is," he said. She told him about Pike, the gap in the evidence. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "When Varr came to me the first time," he said slowly, "before you arrived, before any of this, he sent a letter first. Formal letter offering to purchase the eastern pasture. Lawyer's letterhead. I didn't know that. It's in the house somewhere. I kept it because..." He paused. "I'm not sure why I kept it. I keep most things." But the letter referenced the water access specifically, and it was CC'd to the Territorial Commerce Office. She looked at him. Pike's office. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Land transactions get copied to Commerce sometimes for tax purposes. Or, she said, Varr was informing Pike that negotiations were beginning. So Pike would know when to start adjusting the freight rates. Everett reached past her and pulled the ledger open to November of the previous year. He found the entry he was looking for and turned it toward her. The freight cost jumped the first one, the one she'd noticed months ago in a page he'd left open. The letter came in October, he said. She looked at the date on the ledger entry. November 3rd. 4 weeks later, she said. 4 weeks after Varr informed Pike's office that negotiations were starting, Everett said, and 3 weeks after I refused to sell. She sat back in the chair. That letter connects them, she said. If the CC notation to Pike's office can be verified against the rate change timeline, it's not proof of payment. No, she said, but it's proof of coordination. A letter goes to Pike's office announcing the negotiation starts, and within a month, the target rancher's freight rates increase. That's not coincidence, that's process. She looked at the ledger, at the date, at everything on the table around her. We need that letter, she said. Everett stood up. I'll find it tonight. He went to the house and she waited in the barn office with the evidence spread around her, and 20 minutes later, he came back with a folded paper that had the particular quality of something that had been kept without quite knowing why. She read it twice. The CC notation was there. Clear and unambiguous CC. Pike, Territorial Commerce Office, Caldwell. This goes with the rest of it, she said. To Judge Mercer? She looked up. Has Mercer been assigned? Beach sent word yesterday. I forgot to tell you the case has been assigned for a formal hearing. Judge Elias Mercer. He's out of the Territorial Court. Rides the Northern Circuit. What do you know about him? Not much. Old. Doesn't like to be delayed. Has a reputation for reading documents himself, rather than relying on lawyers to summarize them. She thought about that. Then we give him everything, she said. Every piece. Organized clearly so he can follow it himself, without anyone's interpretation in the way. She started reordering the documents on the table, and Everett pulled his chair closer and started helping, and they worked like that for another hour. Two people building an argument together in a lamplit room, sorting through the evidence of a man's long and careful wrongdoing, neither of them saying the obvious thing, which was that somewhere in the last few months, this had stopped being Everett's fight that Mara was helping with, and had become something that belonged equally to both of them. Outside, the Montana night was clear and huge, and the eastern pasture lay quiet under stars, the water source catching whatever light came down, silver and still. It had no idea what was coming, but Mara did. Judge Elias Mercer arrived in Harlow on a Tuesday morning in a wagon that was considerably less impressive than his reputation, driven by a young clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and handled the reins with the specific anxiety of someone who knew the man behind him, noticed everything. Mercer himself was 72 years old, thin in the way some men get thin when they've stopped eating for pleasure and kept eating only for function, with white hair cut short and eyes so pale they were nearly colorless. He had the kind of face that didn't telegraph what it was thinking, which Mara decided, when she first saw him cross the courthouse steps, was either very good news or very bad news, depending on what was underneath it. The hearing was set for Thursday. Mara spent Tuesday night and all of Wednesday going through the evidence one final time. Not looking for new things she'd stopped, looking for new things, but checking what she had against what she knew would be challenged. Trying to find the questions a careful judge might ask that she didn't have clean answers for. She did this the way she did most things, alone, at the table in the barn office, with a lamp and a cold cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink. Everett came in at 10 o'clock and sat down without being invited, which he'd started doing somewhere around the third week of evidence gathering, and which she'd stopped remarking on. Stop going through it again, he said. I'm checking the freight records against the letter timeline. You've done that 4 times. 5, she said. The 5th time found the date discrepancy I almost missed. He didn't argue with that. He sat and watched her work for a while, and eventually he said, Dottie Crane sent word she's coming tomorrow. She'll be in Harlow by noon. Good. She looked up. Sayer wrote back, he's coming. And Calloway? Fen Calloway does not need to be reminded of appointments, Everett said, with a dryness that was as close to a joke as he usually got. He was probably ready last week. She almost smiled. The tension in her shoulders didn't entirely release, but it moved. which was something. "Tell me what's worrying you most," Everett said. She set down her pen. "Varr's lawyer, Colby, he's good. I've been asking around. He's argued boundary cases before, and he knows how to make technical documentation look like speculation. He'll take Purvis's survey and say it's one surveyor's interpretation against another. And he'll take the freight records and say commercial rate changes are normal business practice. And he'll take Calloway's testimony and say the memory of a 71-year-old man regarding a boundary stone is not evidence." She looked at the papers. "Each piece of what we have, he can explain away individually. The argument only holds if Mercer can see the whole shape of it, the pattern, the method, the way each element connects to the others. And if Mercer's the kind of judge who looks at each piece separately, then we have a problem." She picked up the pen again. But Beach said he reads documents himself. A man who reads documents himself is usually a man who thinks about what the documents mean in relation to each other. "That's what I'm counting on." Everett was quiet. "That's not nothing to count on," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." She went back to the freight records and he stayed in the chair, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the lamp burned between them. And outside the Montana night was the same huge silent thing it always was, indifferent to what happened in courtrooms. Courthouse in Harlow was a single large room, with long windows and wooden benches that had been built for a congregation before the county needed them for law. It smelled of pine and old paper, and the particular human smell of a room where people came when things were serious. By 8:30 Thursday morning, it was already nearly full. Mara had not expected that. She'd expected the principals Varr and his people, Mercer and his clerk, Everett, the witnesses. She had not expected the ranchers. 12 of them, maybe 14, sitting in the benches with their hats in their hands and their faces careful. Some of them she recognized from her rides across the county, the man Solus, the woman Harkett. Others she didn't know. She found a seat beside Everett in the front row and leaned close to him. "Who are all these people?" she said quietly. "Word got around," he said. "About the hearing, about what we filed. They came to watch?" "They came because they wanted to see if it's possible," he said, "for somebody to stand up to Varr and have it mean something." She looked across the room. Gideon Varr was at the table on the far side, in a coat that was visibly more expensive than everything else in the room. His lawyer, Colby, sat beside him, a lean man with a precise face who was already reading through papers. 2 associates sat behind them. Varr looked at the room with the expression of a man attending something he found mildly inconvenient, but was confident would resolve in his favor. He didn't look at Mara, which meant he'd looked at her already, quickly, before she'd found her seat, and had already made the decision not to look again. She'd seen that before in men who'd been briefed about her specifically. They came in having decided what she was and didn't want to be revised. Mercer came in at 9 o'clock exactly, and the room went from low murmur to complete silence in about 2 seconds, which told Mara everything she needed to know about how this judge was regarded. He sat. He looked at the room, not the 2 tables specifically, but the whole room, the benches of watching people, the windows, the clerk's table. He had the unhurried quality of a man who understood that the hearing was his and would proceed at exactly the pace he set. "We're here on the matter of the Hale boundary dispute," he said. His voice was dry and carrying and accustomed to rooms. "I've read the filed documents from both parties. I have questions for both parties. I'll start with the respondent." Varr's lawyer stood immediately, which meant he'd been prepared for this. "Your Honor, the matter is straightforward. Our survey." "Sit down, Mr. Colby," Mercer said. "I said I'd start with the respondent. I'll ask the questions. You'll answer them." Colby sat. Mercer looked at Varr. "Mr. Varr, your survey references the 4th boundary marker on the eastern line as a primary reference point." "That's correct, Your Honor." "Who placed that marker in its current position?" A brief pause. "The marker was found in its current position by our surveyor." "Found," Mercer said. "Yes. Not verified against the original 1,871 land grant records. The marker is consistent with Mr. Varr. I'm going to ask you to answer what I asked you. Did your surveyor verify the 4th marker's position against the original 1,871 land grant reference point, which is the rocky outcrop on the ridge above the eastern line?" Another pause. "Longer. I would need to consult with my surveyor on the specific methodology," Varr said. "I expect you'll have the chance," Mercer said. "Sit down." He looked at the other table. "Mr. Hale, who is presenting your documentation?" Everett stood. I am, Your Honor, with the assistance of Miss Mara Whitlock, who compiled the primary evidence. Miss Whitlock may assist, Mercer said, and looked at Mara directly for the first time. Something moved in his pale eyes assessment, quick and practiced. You compiled the survey documentation and the witness statements? She stood beside Everett. Yes, Your Honor. You have legal training? No, Your Honor. What training do you have? I kept books for a grain supplier in Laramie for 2 winters. I have experience with documentation, ledger verification, and identifying discrepancies in recorded accounts. And the survey discrepancy you identified was confirmed by independent surveyor Abel Purvis, whose report is in the filed documents, she said. I identified the soil disturbance at the 4th marker. Purvis measured the displacement formally. His measurement was 9 inches from the marker's original position, which he verified against the 1,871 grant reference point. Mercer looked at his documents. He read for approximately 45 seconds, in complete silence, while the room waited. Mr. Colby, he said, without looking up. Your client's surveyor. Is he present? Colby stood. He is, Your Honor. Good. He'll testify this morning. Varr's surveyor was a man named Howell, 40 years old, with the slightly defensive posture of someone who'd been told the morning was going to be difficult, and was trying not to show that he believed it. Colby handled him first, asking questions designed to establish the survey's legitimacy, the instruments used, the methodology, the filing process. Howell answered competently and with the smooth consistency of prepared testimony. Then Mercer looked at Mara. She hadn't expected to conduct the questioning herself. She'd expected Mercer to take over. But he said, Miss Whitlock, you may proceed, in the tone of a man who'd decided something and wasn't going to explain what. She stood up. She looked at the surveyor. Mr. Howell, she said, when you set up your transit for the eastern boundary measurements, what did you use as your primary reference point? The boundary marker at the 4th position, he said. Which specific feature of the boundary marker? He paused. The stone itself. You used the stone as the reference point, she said, not the rocky outcrop on the ridge above the line. The stone is the marker. The stone is a marker placed to reflect the original survey, which used the outcrop as its reference point. The 1,871 land grant documentation specifies the outcrop as the fixed reference, because stone markers can be moved and outcrops cannot. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Did you consult the 1,871 land grant documentation before conducting your survey? Another pause. The room was very still. I had the current boundary records, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at Colby. Colby's face was giving him nothing. I did not consult the 1,871 grant specifically, Howell said. So you surveyed a boundary using a marker whose position you had not verified against the original fixed reference point. The marker's position was, Mr. Howell, she said, and her voice stayed even. Independent surveyor Abel Purvis consulted the 1,871 grant documentation, used the ridge outcrop as the fixed reference point, and found that the 4th boundary marker is currently positioned 9 inches south of where it should be according to the original grant. His report is in these proceedings. She looked at him. Does that change your understanding of what your survey was measuring? The silence in the room had a quality she recognized, the particular held breath quality of people watching something that they hadn't been sure was going to happen actually happening. Howell looked at the table. It may have affected the measurement, he said quietly. May have, she repeated. Mercer said from the bench, Mr. Howell, let me ask you directly. Did anyone instruct you to use the boundary stone rather than the original grant reference point? The longest pause yet. Your Honor, it's a yes or no question. Howell looked at Varr. Just for a moment. He couldn't help it. Mercer saw it. The whole room saw it. Yes, Howell said. His voice had gone smaller. I was told to base my measurements on the current marker positions. Told by whom? By the man who hired me. Which was? Howell looked at the table. Mr. Varr's associate. A man named Denton. The room broke its silence in a low wave of sound that Mercer let run for about 5 seconds before he said, simply order, and it stopped. Colby spent 20 minutes trying to rehabilitate the damage, asking Howell clarifying questions, using language designed to reframe what had been said as a simple misunderstanding of methodology. Mara sat and listened and made notes and didn't interrupt, because there was nothing Colby could do with what had already been said, and she knew it, and she thought Colby probably knew it too. When Howell stepped down, Mercer called Fen Calloway. The old man came forward with his cane and the unimpressed expression of someone who'd seen considerably more difficult things than a courtroom. He testified about the boundary stone cleanly, and without drama 30 years on the ridge, the stone's original position, his certainty. Colby cross-examined and got nothing useful, because Calloway had the particular credibility of a man who had absolutely nothing to gain from lying and looked it. Then Mercer called Dottie Crane. She testified about the freight rates, the stockyard rejections, the water dispute that had appeared without warning all of it. She was not smooth. She stumbled twice and had to look at her records to remember specific dates. And once she stopped speaking for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable, looking at her hands before she continued. But that lack of smoothness was, in its way, more compelling than polished testimony would have been. She was a woman telling the truth about something that had cost her everything, and it looked exactly like that. Solis followed. Then Harkett. By the time Martin Sayer took the seat, the room had the quality of something building toward a point. Sayer testified about the freight rate records from his time as freight inspector, the pattern, the timing, the correlation with Varr's failed purchase negotiations. He was precise and technical in the way of a man who'd had 2 years to think about what he should have said when he'd had the chance. Then he said Pike's name. I brought my findings to Harold Pike, the territorial commerce official who oversaw freight regulation, he said. I showed him the rate adjustment records and explained what I believed they indicated. Within 2 weeks of that conversation, a story began circulating that I had accepted bribes. Mercer looked up from his notes. You reported a concern to Mr. Pike, and 2 weeks later you were accused of corruption. Yes, Your Honor. And the investigation into that accusation found. No evidence, Sayer said. I was cleared. But the damage was done. Mercer wrote something. Then, is Mr. Pike present today? The clerk went to the back of the room and came back and said something quietly to Mercer, who nodded. He's been sent for, Mercer said, and the hearing broke for 30 minutes. Mara walked outside during the break because she needed air, and because sitting still for 3 hours with the level of concentration the morning had required had her wound tight enough that she needed to move or she was going to say something she hadn't planned to say. She stood on the courthouse steps in the summer heat and breathed. Everett came out and stood beside her. Howell broke, he said. I know. I didn't think he would. Neither did I, she admitted. He was prepared. But Mercer's question was direct in a way Colby couldn't have coached him for, because it asked him to lie explicitly to a judge, rather than just shape his testimony carefully. She looked at the street. There's a difference between evasion and lying under oath, and some people feel that difference more than others. Everett nodded. Varr looked at his lawyer when Howell admitted it. I saw, not angry. More like calculating, she said. He's still working the problem. He's not the kind of man who admits it's over until it's over. Is it over? She thought about it honestly. Howell's admission plus Purvis's survey should settle the boundary. That part, yes. But the larger case Pike, the pattern, the other ranchers, that's going to be a longer process. Today isn't an ending. It's enough of a beginning that the ending becomes possible. He was quiet for a moment. That's an honest answer. I don't know another kind, she said. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her more frequently in the last few weeks, steady and open, like he'd decided to stop pretending he didn't see the things he saw. When this is done, he said, I want to talk to you about something. But not today. But soon, she looked at him. About the ranch? About you, he said. And about me. And about what I think is true between us that neither of us has said directly. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. The clerk appeared in the doorway and said the hearing was resuming, and they went back inside. Harold Pike was a man who'd spent 20 years being important in a specific and regional way, which had given him a practiced air of authority that he wore like a coat he'd forgotten he could take off. He came in looking like a man who expected to clarify a misunderstanding and leave. That lasted approximately 4 minutes. Mercer questioned him directly about the rate adjustments that Sayer had documented. Pike's answers were careful, not evasive enough to be obvious, but careful in the way that careful answers are, when the person giving them knows the records exist and is trying to shape the narrative around them without contradicting facts that can be checked. Then Mara passed the letter forward. Varr's letter to Everett, the formal purchase offer from the previous October. The one with the CC notation at the bottom, H. Pike, Territorial Commerce Office, Caldwell. Mercer looked at it. He looked at his notes. where he'd presumably written the date from Sayer's testimony about the rate changes. He looked at the letter again. "Mr. Pike," he said, "this letter, which was sent to Mr. Hale as a purchase offer from Mr. Varr, was copied to your office in October of last year. You received this copy? Correspondence of that nature sometimes comes through the office on tax matters. Did you receive this specific letter?" Pike's jaw tightened. "I may have. The rate adjustment for shipments originating from the Hale Ranch occurred in November," Mercer said. "The month after this letter was copied to your office." He set the letter down precisely. "Can you explain that timing? Rate adjustments are made on a regional basis. Mr. Sayer's records, which you have not disputed the accuracy of, show that rate adjustments during this period applied specifically to the Hale operation and 3 other ranchers, all of whom had recently refused purchase offers from Mr. Varr, while surrounding shippers saw no change." Mercer's voice had not risen at any point in the morning. It didn't rise now. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. Did your office coordinate freight rate adjustments with Gideon Varr in connection with his land acquisition activities?" The room had never been more completely silent. Pike looked at Varr. It was a different look than Howell's, not a plea, not a question. More like a man checking whether the thing he was about to do would be noticed. Varr's face was stone. Pike looked back at Mercer. "I want to speak with a lawyer," he said, which was, in its way, the loudest possible answer. The hearing broke for 90 minutes while Mercer conferred with his clerk and a man from the territorial marshal's office, who had appeared, quietly, at some point during the morning and was now standing near the back wall, with the patient stillness of someone who'd been given instructions and was waiting to follow them. In those 90 minutes, the courthouse steps became a gathering place. Ranchers who'd been inside came out and stood in groups, talking in low voices. Dottie Crane sat on the step and drank water and looked like a woman who'd just set down something she'd been carrying for a long time. Sayer stood apart, looking at the street, and Mara walked over to him. "You did well," she said. He looked at her. "It's not done." "No, but it moved." He nodded slowly. "Pike asking for a lawyer means he knows he's exposed," she said. "A man who has a clean answer gives the clean answer. He waits for a lawyer because he needs help figuring out how much to say. Will he talk? If the marshal's involvement is what I think it is, a formal inquiry rather than just presence, then Pike's calculation changes. He's either Varr's ally until the end, or he's the man who cooperates early and gets the better outcome." She looked at the street. Men like Pike generally make that choice based on math, not loyalty. Sayer was quiet for a moment. "You really were just a ranch hand when you started this." "I still am," she said. "No," he said, not unkindly. "You're not." She didn't answer that. She went to find Everett. He was standing near the wagon, not because he needed to be there, but because he needed to be somewhere that wasn't the courthouse steps. She knew that about him now, that he processed hard things by putting a small distance between himself and other people, not because he was withdrawing, but because he needed the space to settle. She stood beside him without saying anything for a while. "Pike's going to talk," he said finally. "I think so." "And then?" "And then Mercer has enough to refer the larger case to the territorial prosecutor. The boundary dispute gets resolved. The broader fraud case starts moving through a different process." He looked at the courthouse. "It's bigger than us now. It was always bigger than us. We just got it to a place where bigger than us was possible." He turned and looked at her all the way, the kind of look he didn't give things casually. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "When you walked through my gate wrapped in burlap, bleeding through your heel, with that empty bag, I thought I was doing you a favor by giving you a job." He said it with the directness of a man getting something said that he'd been building toward for a long time. "I was wrong. You've done more for this ranch and for me than I have words for. And I'm not," he stopped. "I'm not good at saying things like this. I don't have the practice." "You're doing fine," she said. "I don't want you to think you have to stay because you need the work," he said. "Because what we have here, what I think we have. Everett. What I want us to have, Everett." She said it with enough weight that he stopped. She looked at him steadily, the way she'd looked at him the first morning, holding the eye contact with nothing to apologize for. "I know what you're trying to say." "Then say it back to me," he said. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing. "I stayed because the work was honest," she said. "I stayed because you are. And somewhere between the barn roof and the barn office, and every hard day in between, I stopped thinking about leaving." She paused. I don't need to be somewhere I'm tolerated, Everett. I've been tolerated most of my life. This place is the first one where I feel like I'm supposed to be here. He looked at her for a long moment. You're supposed to be here, he said. Quiet and certain, like a boundary marker set correctly against a fixed point. She held his gaze. I know. When the hearing reconvened, Mercer announced 3 things. The first, Purvis's independent survey, was accepted as definitive. The boundary of the Hale Ranch's eastern line was confirmed according to the 1,871 land grant, and Varr's disputed claim was rejected. The second, the evidence regarding freight rate manipulation, coordinated with the testimony of Martin Sayer and the documentary record, was sufficient to open a formal investigation by the Territorial Commerce Authority into Harold Pike's conduct. Pike, who had spent the recess with the Territorial Marshal's deputy, had indicated his willingness to cooperate. The third, the evidence of coordinated land acquisition fraud, as documented by the pattern of freight disruption, water disputes, legal threats, and the fraudulent survey, taken together, with testimony from multiple affected parties, was being referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review. Mercer said all of this in the same dry, carrying voice he'd used all morning. He didn't editorialize. He didn't congratulate anyone. He looked at Varr for exactly 3 seconds before he looked at his documents again. Varr sat without moving. His lawyer leaned close and said something that Varr appeared not to hear. Mara watched him from across the room. She thought about the first day she'd seen him, the way he'd ridden through Everett's gate, like he owned the ground his horse was standing on. The way he'd looked at Everett's land and seen only what he wanted to take, and at Everett himself and seen only an obstacle. The way he'd looked at her, in the yard with his 6 men behind him, and miscalculated everything. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in the good way, the way you're tired after a long day of work that needed doing and got done. The room was moving around her, people standing. Voices starting up again. The marshal's deputy making his way toward the front. Dottie Crane, from across the room, caught her eye and nodded once. A small and serious movement that meant everything it needed to mean. Everett stood beside her. It's not finished, he said quietly. No, she agreed. But it started. He put his hand on the back of her chair, not touching her. Just there, and she felt the weight of it, that small and particular nearness, and didn't move away. Outside, through the courthouse windows, the summer afternoon was going on. The street of Harlow was doing what streets do. People were going about their business, unaware or only half aware that something had shifted in that wooden room that smelled of pine and old paper. In the benches behind them, one of the ranchers, the man Solus, leaned over to his neighbor and said something in a low voice. The neighbor nodded. A few rows back, a woman Mara didn't recognize was crying quietly, not with grief but with the particular release of someone who'd needed something to be possible and had just watched it become possible. Mara saw it and looked away, because some things shouldn't be witnessed too directly. And Gideon Varr, across the room, began, for the first time, to look like a man who understood that the ground he'd been standing on for 20 years had just shifted underneath him, and there was no amount of money or legal maneuvering or deliberate cruelty that was going to shift it back. The ride home from Harlow that evening was quieter than the ride in had been, which was different from being empty. Mara sat beside Everett on the wagon seat with the leather satchel on her lap, lighter now, since most of what it had contained was filed with the court or entered into the official record, and watched the land go by in the long amber light of a summer evening that had no interest in what had happened in. A courthouse that day, and was beautiful regardless. She was tired in a way that went past her body. The kind of tired that comes from holding something carefully for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Not all the way down, she understood that the territorial prosecutor's process would take months, and that Pike's cooperation would have to be negotiated, and that Varr's lawyers would find angles she hadn't anticipated but enough down that she could feel the absence of the weight, which had its own particular sensation. Everett drove without talking, which she'd learned to read as comfort rather than distance. He was a man who said things when he had them ready, and not before, and she'd stopped waiting for him to fill silences that didn't need filling. They were 3 miles from the ranch when he said, "Solus asked me something during the break." She looked at him. "What?" He asked if you'd be willing to help him look at his original land grant. He thinks there might be a similar issue with his western boundary, the one he sold to Varr's associate 3 years ago. Everett kept his eyes on the road. He wants to know if the sale can be challenged. She was quiet for a moment. It's more complicated when a sale has already occurred. The legal basis is different. You'd need to prove the sale was coerced, not just that the boundary was disputed. Can it be done? Maybe. If the freight manipulation is proven as a systematic tool of coercion, a good lawyer could argue the sale was made under duress. But that's a civil suit, not a boundary filing. She looked at the road ahead. He needs an actual lawyer. Not me, he knows that. He wants to know if you'd help him understand what he's looking at before he hires one, so he doesn't go in blind. She turned that over in her mind. She'd spent the last 2 months doing exactly that, helping people understand what they were looking at, so the next step was possible. It had never been the plan. It had just been what the situation required, one piece at a time. Tell him to come by on Saturday, she said. I'll look at what he has. Everett nodded, as if that were the obvious answer, which for him it probably was. The ranch gate came into view, and Mara felt something she didn't have a precise name for, a kind of recognition. The way you feel when you see something from a distance that your body knows before your mind catches up. She'd come through that gate, barefoot and bleeding, with an empty bag, and no reasonable expectation that anything on the other side of it would be different from everything she'd left behind. She hadn't known how wrong that turned out to be a reasonable thing to think. The weeks that followed the hearing had the quality of an exhale, not relaxed exactly, but pressure released. The ranch work continued, because ranch work doesn't care about legal proceedings, and Mara was in the northern pasture replacing wire 2 days after the hearing and repairing the chicken coop roof 3 days after that, and the ordinary rhythm of it was, she found exactly what she needed. The news came in pieces. Pike had cooperated. His statement to the territorial prosecutor confirmed what Sayer's records had implied, that he had coordinated freight rate adjustments with Varr's office in exchange for payments made through a third party, a freighting company that Varr controlled through a cousin's name. The payments were small enough to seem unremarkable individually and large enough in aggregate to constitute something the prosecutor described, in the official filing that Beach sent a copy of to the land office in Harlow, as systematic bribery of a territorial official. When Everett read that part to Mara from the copy Aldous Beach had sent, she was at the kitchen table eating lunch, and she set down her fork and said nothing for a moment. Small payments, she said. Spread out so they looked like normal business. Yes, the same method he used on the ranchers. Small pressures spread out so each one looked like bad luck. She picked up her fork again. It's the same thinking all the way down. He found a system and applied it to everything. Everett set the document on the table. Pike loses his position. The investigation into his conduct is official. What about the freight rates? For the ranchers still operating? He looked further down the document. The rates are being reviewed. Beach's note says, the Commerce Authority is expected to order corrections within 30 days. She thought about the ranchers who'd sat in those courthouse benches, the ones still working their land, still absorbing costs that had been artificially inflated to wear them down. 30 days was 30 days, and the money already spent was gone, but the correction mattered. It meant the mechanism Varr had been using stopped working. That's something, she said. It's more than something, Everett said. She looked at him. He said things like that, sometimes simple and direct, pushing back when she reduced things down to less than they were. She'd noticed it enough times now to understand it was deliberate. He paid attention to the habit she had of making her own contributions smaller, and he consistently refused to let it stand. She was still getting used to that. Dottie Crane came to the ranch on a Thursday in early September, which surprised Mara because she hadn't been expecting her. She came in a wagon driven by a young man who turned out to be her nephew, and she had a box of papers on the seat beside her and the look of a woman who'd decided something and come to say it in person. Mara met her in the yard. I got a letter from a lawyer in Caldwell, Dottie said, before she was fully down from the wagon. About my property. About what happened. Sit down, Mara said. Tell me. They sat on the porch, the two of them, and Dottie laid out what the lawyer had written, that the ongoing investigation into Varr's practices had opened a potential path for civil buy-sellers who could demonstrate that the conditions leading to their sale were deliberately manufactured, that it would be a long process, that there were no guarantees, that it would require her to document what had happened in the months before she sold. He says I have records, Dottie said. The same records I brought you. They're exactly what he needs, Mara said. Dottie looked at her hands. I stopped believing anything would come of any of this. After I sold. After the years went by. She smoothed the edge of the paper on her knee. I stopped believing people like Varr ever actually paid for anything. Some don't, Mara said honestly. Some of them operate long enough that by the time the case is built, they've moved their assets and rearranged their affairs, and the practical consequences are smaller than they should be. She looked at the old woman. I can't promise you get the land back, Dottie. I won't say that. But the record now exists. What he did is on paper officially in a form that follows him. And if the civil case moves forward, even a partial recovery is more than you had 2 weeks ago. Dottie looked at the yard, at the ranch around them. At Mara, in the particular way, people look at someone they're trying to categorize and can't quite. What made you start, she said. You were new here. You didn't know any of us. You could have just done your job and stayed out of it. Mara thought about how to answer that honestly. I saw the pattern, she said. And I've spent most of my life being the person that patterns like that get used on. Not the same pattern, different tools, but the same idea. Find someone who doesn't have enough power to push back and take what you want. She paused. I've been walked past and talked over and looked through my whole life. And I've watched other people go through the same thing. And I've thought someone should say something. Someone should do something. She looked at Dottie. I finally got tired of waiting for someone else to be that person. Dottie was quiet for a moment. You're a big woman, she said. Mara looked at her. I mean that simply, Dottie said. Not the way people say it to be unkind. I mean you take up the space you're supposed to take up. I've known women my whole life who made themselves smaller because they thought it was required. You don't do that. Mara held the old woman's gaze. I did, for a long time, she said. I got tired of that, too. Dottie nodded slowly. She folded the lawyer's letter and put it back in her box. I'm going to write to him, she said. Tell him I'm in. Good, Mara said. Keep copies of everything, Dottie almost smiled. You sound like yourself when you say that. I've been told, Mara said. The conversation she and Everett had been circling since the courthouse steps happened on an evening in late September, when the first cold edge had come into the Montana air and the light had the particular gold of a season changing. They were sitting on the porch after supper, not because it was comfortable. The air was cool enough to make her wish for a second layer, but because neither of them had gone inside yet, and there was an unspoken agreement that the porch was where certain things got said. Everett had been looking at the eastern pasture for a while, the way he sometimes looked at land reading it, assessing it, thinking through it. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, and I want to ask it plainly, because I'm not good at the other way. She looked at him. You're better at the other way than you think, maybe. He turned to look at her directly. I don't want you to be the ranch hand, Mara. She waited. He stopped. Started again. When I posted that notice, I needed someone to do the work. That's what I thought I needed. And you came and you did the work, and you did it better than anyone I've ever hired. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, he looked at his hands, then back at her. You're not working for me. You've been working beside me for months. There's a difference, and I think we both know it. And I'm tired of not saying it out loud. She was quiet. What are you asking me, she said. To stay, he said, not as a hand. As I want this ranch to be yours as much as it's mine. I want to build something here with you. He paused. I lost my wife and my boy 6 years ago, and I made my peace with the idea that the ranch would just be the ranch land and work, and nothing more. I didn't think I was the kind of man who got a second time at something. He looked at her steadily. I was wrong about that. She looked at the eastern pasture, the water source glinting in the last light, the fence line she'd repaired post by post, the barn roof she'd stripped and replaced in the summer heat. I'm not an easy person, she said. I notice things and I say them, and I don't make myself small to make other people comfortable. I've been told my whole life that those things are problems. I know, he said. I'm asking you anyway. I don't have anything, she said. No property, no money saved worth mentioning. I came here with a cloth bag and burlap on my feet. I know that too. I'm saying it so it's said. She looked at him. I'm not bringing anything but myself. That's what I'm asking for, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about every place she'd been before this, every job that ended, every town that made clear she didn't belong there, every person who'd looked at her body or her situation or her past and decided she'd already been weighed and found to be less than enough. She thought about walking 7 miles on a bleeding foot to ask for a job she hadn't been offered, and what it said about how low she'd set her expectations for what she was allowed to want. She thought about what it felt like to fix the barn roof and repair the fence and know that the land was better for her being on it. and to have the person who owned that land look at what she'd done and say, without saying it out loud, that he saw it, that he saw her. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that she thought had been held for longer than the conversation. Yes, she said again, more quietly, because it felt like something worth saying twice. They didn't make a production of it. He reached over and put his hand on hers, rough-palmed and careful, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that on the porch while the evening came in cold and real around them. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said right then. They married in October, beneath the old cottonwood at the far corner of the ranch yard, on a morning that was cold enough to see your breath. It was not a large event. Fen Calloway was there, leaning on his cane, with the expression of a man who approved of things he didn't need to say out loud. Martin Sayer came, which surprised Mara, but when she thought about it later, she understood he'd been the person who showed up when it mattered, and some people just keep doing that. Dottie Crane sent a note that arrived the day before, which said only, "Good. You deserve a place that's yours." The county judge who performed the ceremony was a small man named Ferris, who said the necessary words with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd said them many times and respected them enough not to decorate them unnecessarily. When it was done, Everett looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to understand was his version of everything he felt, but couldn't organize into sentences. She looked back with the same. They had supper in the kitchen that evening Mara had cooked, because she'd wanted to, because it was hers to do in her own kitchen on her own terms rather than as a service. And Calloway ate 3 helpings and didn't compliment the food directly, but said twice that he wasn't hungry when she offered to clear his plate, which meant the same thing. Sayer said, at some point during the evening, whatever happens with the prosecutor's case, and I think it goes well. I think Varr is finished. You should know that what you built here, the documentation, the witness network, the way you put it all together, that's going to matter for a long time past this. She looked at him. It mattered for the people it was built for. That's enough. Maybe, he said. But these things have a way of teaching people what's possible. Dottie's case, if it goes through. Solis's potential challenge. Other ranchers who see those and know what was done and realize they might be able to do something similar. He held his coffee cup. You showed people that someone with no formal standing, no legal training, no money, and no powerful connections could look at a powerful man's operation and find the places where it didn't hold up. That's not a small thing. She thought about that for a moment. I just noticed things, she said. You wrote them down, he said. You didn't talk yourself out of it. You didn't decide it wasn't your place. You didn't make yourself smaller than the problem. He set down his cup. Most people do one of those 3 things and stop. She didn't have an answer to that. That wasn't more honest than she was ready to be in company, so she got up and cleared the plates instead. The verdict on Gideon Varr came in February. It came by letter, from the territorial prosecutor's office, addressed to Everett but understood by both of them to be as much hers as his. Mara read it first because she was the one who went to pick up the mail, and she read it standing at the post office counter while the clerk pretended not to watch. Convicted. Fraud, coercion, and conspiracy in connection with his land acquisition practices over a period of 4 years. The sentence was a combination of substantial fines and the stripping of properties acquired through the documented fraudulent methods. The network of freight manipulation had been formally dismantled through Pike's cooperation and the Commerce Authority's order. The unfair rates had been reversed the previous November. She folded the letter and put it in the satchel, the same old cracked leather satchel from the barn office that she'd carried to Caldwell the first time, now worn even more at the corners but still solid, and she rode home. Everett was in the barn when she got there. He was with Cutter, who had been completely sound for 4 months and showed no sign of the injury that had seemed so worrying in the early summer. She stood in the barn doorway, and he looked up and read something in her face. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it, the stillness in his face, the way his jaw worked slightly once and then stopped. "The properties," he said, "acquired through fraud." "Does that mean Solis's western pasture is specifically named?" she said. "There's a process for restitution. It's not automatic and it's not fast, but it's open." He set the letter down on the stall rail. He put his hand on Cutter's neck, a gesture she recognized as his way of grounding himself the horse solid and warm and present when other things were moving fast. "Varr spent 20 years building that," he said. "And it's gone. Not all of it, she said. Some of those sales won't be reversible. Some of the money's unrecoverable. It's not a perfect outcome it never was going to be. She looked at the letter. But the framework he built, the way he used freight rates and legal pressure and corrupt us to manufacture inevitability for people who didn't have the resources to question it, that's gone. The tools don't work anymore. Pike is out. The Commerce Authority is under new oversight. The method doesn't have a mechanism. Everett looked at her. You're explaining it like you need me to understand it, he said. I need to understand it myself, she said honestly. I've been thinking about it all the way home, and I keep looking for the place where it isn't enough, because I spent so long building the case that I got used to finding what was missing. He crossed the barn and stood in front of her. What's missing? He asked. She thought about it for a real moment. Nothing, she said. Not today. He put his arms around her not carefully, the way he'd touched her hand on the porch in September, but straightforwardly. The way you hold something you're not afraid of losing anymore, because it's yours. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and felt the specific weight of a day that had been carrying a lot of days inside it. They stood like that in the barn doorway while Cutter went back to his hay, and the February light came in cold and clear, and the eastern pasture, their eastern pasture. The water source glinting at the far edge was exactly where it had always been, unchanged by everything that had happened, and somehow more itself for it. Spring came in late, which it often did in Montana, and when it came hard, the ground softening fast and the grass coming up sudden and green and the creek running full with snowmelt. Mara was in the garden on a morning in April, planting the bean furrow straighter this year than last, because she'd taken more care with the string line when she heard the wagon on the road. It was Dottie Crane. She came through the gate, with her nephew driving again, and she was sitting straighter in the seat than she'd been sitting the last time. And when she climbed down, she had the look of a woman who'd been told something she'd stopped expecting to be told. The civil judgment came through, she said. Partial restitution. Not the land, it's been resold twice, and there's no undoing that. But money. Enough to buy something else. Her voice was careful. The way people keep their voices careful around things they're afraid to feel too much. Not what I had. Not the same. But something. Mara took off her gardening gloves. That's more than it was, she said. Yes. Dottie looked around the yard. At the bean furrow, at the barn with its solid roof, at the ranch that had become, over the past months, something you could see was cared for just by looking at it. You look different, do I? You look like you live here, Dottie said simply. Mara looked around the yard with the particular attention of someone seeing a familiar thing freshly. I do, she said. They had coffee on the porch, the three of them, Dottie, Mara, and Everett, who'd come in from the north pasture when he saw the wagon, and Dottie told them about the civil judgment and the process, and the property she was considering in a settlement 2 counties east, and Mara listened and asked questions, and Everett refilled the coffee without being asked, and the morning went by the way good mornings do, without anyone trying to make it more than it was. When Dottie left, she hugged Mara on the porch steps, which neither of them had planned, and which lasted about 3 seconds and was enough. Come find me when you're settled, Mara said. I will, Dottie said. I want you to see that it worked. That afternoon, Mara walked the eastern boundary. She did it alone, not because Everett wasn't welcome, but because she wanted the time with it, the land, the fence line, the marker stones, the particular walk from south to north that she'd made with Purvis in the heat of the previous summer, with so much uncertain and so much still to do. She walked it slowly. She checked each post as she went, not because she needed to. The fence was sound, but because that was the habit, and the habit was part of who she was on this land. At the 4th marker, she stopped. The stone was exactly where Purvis had placed it, 9 inches north of where Varr's people had moved it, back in its original position against the ground that had held it for 35 years before. Someone decided that 9 inches was all the distance needed to take what wasn't theirs. She stood beside it for a while. She thought about a cloth bag with almost nothing in it. 7 miles of road on feet wrapped in burlap. A gate she'd stood outside of and almost hadn't walked through, because she'd been turned away enough times to know that walking through gates didn't necessarily mean anything. She thought about what she'd carried into this ranch and what she'd built here, and she understood the way you understand things that take a long time to arrive, that she hadn't found this place by luck. She'd found it by continuing when continuing was hard, by noticing what other people walked past, by refusing to accept that the size of her body, or the emptiness of her bag, or the wounds on her feet had anything to do with the size of what she was capable of. There was a life lesson in that somewhere, not the kind you put on a wall, not the kind anyone needs to announce. Just the kind that lives in the body of a person who learned it the hard way and doesn't need to say it out loud, because every day of how they live is already saying it. The lesson was simply this: being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe the estimate. She'd stopped believing it somewhere between the barn roof and the barn office, and 100 mornings of work that no one had asked her to do, and that she'd done anyway, because the land needed it, and she was the person who was there. She turned and walked back along the fence line toward the ranch. The gate came into view. The same gate, the barn behind it solid. The garden green and growing. The house with its repaired porch and its coffee-stained table and its kitchen, where she'd cooked 1,000 meals that fed people she'd come to mean something to. Everett was at the water trough, checking it the way he checked it every afternoon, running a hand along the pipe fitting, looking for the small leak that had been threatening to worsen since February. He looked up when he heard her coming. She came through the gate. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for months, not with the careful assessment of that first day, when he'd been trying to figure out what she was, but with the particular ease of a man who already knew and had stopped needing to figure it out. "How's the line?" he said. "Solid," she said. "Fourth marker's fine." He nodded. He went back to the fitting. She stopped beside him and looked at the ranch, all of it. In the afternoon light, the way you look at something you know belongs to you, not because you were given it, but because you earned it in the oldest sense of the word, by showing up, by staying, by doing the work until the work became yours, and the land became yours, and the life became yours. "Everett," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad I walked through that gate," she said. He held her gaze. "So am I," he said. The afternoon went on. There was still fence to check and animals to feed, and a dozen things that needed doing before dark, and they both knew it, and they went back to work. The woman who had arrived barefoot, bleeding, and carrying almost nothing had become the woman who helped bring down the most powerful man in the county, not because she was exceptional, not because luck had found her, but because she had never once made herself smaller than the problem in front of her. She had only needed one thing that most people spend their whole lives searching for, a place where who she truly was turned out to be exactly enough.